Welcome to Arsenal, where the weapons and war machines of military history come to life. Today we explore the Huey helicopter and air assault over Vietnam and the crews and opponents who gave it its reputation. If you enjoy learning how technology, tactics, and human decisions come together in combat, you can find more articles, podcasts, and resources at trackpads.com. The air smells of fuel, red dust, and burned jungle as a formation of Hueys claws its way toward a clearing in the Central Highlands. Below, a tree line flashes with muzzle blasts, thin streaks of tracer fire reaching upward toward the olive-drab helicopters. Inside one Huey, the entire cabin is alive with vibration, boots buzzing against the floor, and weapons rattling softly in soldiers' hands. A door gunner leans out behind his mounted machine gun, firing short, controlled bursts along the right side of the approach, trying to catch enemy muzzle flashes before they can settle their aim on the aircraft. In those moments, the helicopter feels both huge and terribly fragile. Up front, the pilot flies a shallow descent, holding just enough speed to make a desperate break if fire chews in from the front. The co-pilot calls out airspeed and altitude over the intercom, voice steady from training even if his stomach is a knot. In the back, the crew chief watches rotor clearance as trees whip past frighteningly close, one gloved hand on the frame and the other on the intercom box. He can feel every change in the machine through his fingers, every slight shudder that hints at hard maneuvers or a gust of shifting wind. Arsenal is the Friday feature of Dispatch, U.S. Military History magazine. Ahead, colored smoke drifts across a raw patch of ground that barely deserves to be called a landing zone. The ground unit has thrown that smoke grenade to mark wind and position, but the color also tells the pilots what kind of welcome they can expect. It means hot, contested, and under direct fire. The Huey flares at the last moment, hovering just long enough for the infantry to spill out and fan toward the scrub. Every extra heartbeat on that spot is another chance for a lucky bullet to find the engine, transmission, or tail boom. Then the helicopter is climbing away, lighter by the weight of its squad and heavier with the knowledge that it will almost certainly return to the same patch of contested ground. The pilots bank toward a holding area, watching for fresh smoke and fresh orders. In the cabin, the crew chief and door gunner check weapons and fuel, mentally preparing to do it all again. This is what the Huey is built for, turning terrain that once stopped armies into terrain that merely slows them. It gives commanders a new way to think about time and distance on the battlefield. In the years after the Second World War and the Korean War, the United States Army understood that its old ways of moving people and supplies were reaching their limits. Trucks and armored columns remained chained to roads, bridges, and valleys that a smart opponent could mine, ambush, or simply bypass. Even when those ground forces reached the fight, the journey could take long hours or days, limiting how quickly a commander could reinforce a threatened sector or exploit a sudden opportunity. Jet aircraft brought tremendous firepower and speed, but they needed runways and could not hover above a clearing or land on a ridgeline. The gap between what air units could do and what ground units could reach was growing. Light liaison aircraft and the first practical helicopters had already shown their worth as scouts and rescue platforms. They flew wounded soldiers out of difficult terrain and helped commanders see beyond the next ridgeline. Yet they lacked the power, capacity, and reliability needed to lift full squads and loads of supplies into and out of combat zones on demand. Inside war colleges and planning rooms, strategists were wrestling with two different visions of the future. One imagined scattered mechanized forces on an atomic battlefield, needing rapid evacuation and resupply under the shadow of nuclear weapons. The other imagined limited wars in rough terrain, where small units would have to deploy quickly into jungles, mountains, and rice paddies far from any good road. In both futures, the same question kept returning. How do you give ground forces something like the freedom of movement that air forces already enjoy? Piston-engine helicopters could not solve that problem. They struggled in hot, high conditions and carried too few troops to change the course of a battle. Their maintenance demands were high, and their performance left little margin for error when fully loaded or flying at the edge of their envelopes. What the Army wanted was a turbine-powered utility helicopter that could lift a useful load of troops or supplies, evacuate wounded quickly, and support new airmobile tactics without breaking down under daily combat use. From that demand grew a set of designs that included the helicopter that would eventually be designated the UH-1 Iroquois and almost immediately nicknamed the Huey. It was meant to be a flying truck, a flying ambulance, and a flying gun platform, all wrapped into one adaptable airframe. Planners and pilots expected it to shuttle troops to and from the fight, pull casualties out under fire, and provide its own door gun protection along the way. As doctrine shifted toward air assault and what some called vertical envelopment, where infantry would arrive from above instead of along a road, the Huey and its many variants moved from concept to necessity. By the time the first large units deployed to Vietnam, this helicopter was already being woven into the very structure of how the Army intended to fight, survive, and adapt in a new kind of war. The Huey's story as a fighting machine began long before it was dropping infantry into hot landing zones. In the early 1950s, the United States Army was exploring the idea of air mobility and needed a practical turbine-powered helicopter that could serve as a hard-working utility aircraft instead of a fragile experiment. Bell Helicopter answered that need and won a competition with a clean, relatively simple design built around a single turboshaft engine mounted above the cabin, a two-bladed main rotor, and a slender tail boom. Early prototypes, sometimes designated XH-40, proved that a light helicopter powered by a turbine engine could lift more weight, respond faster to control inputs, and survive better than the piston-powered aircraft already in service. Those tests gave planners confidence that a helicopter could be more than a niche rescue or observation platform. As flight testing expanded, engineers and soldiers confronted the trade-offs that would shape the finished machine. Pushing for more power and lift meant designing a stronger transmission and rotor system, while the Army insisted on a cabin big enough to carry a useful squad of troops with their gear. Every kilogram given to armor or electronics had to be justified against fuel load and the weight of the soldiers sitting on the benches. Designers refined the fuselage shape to improve visibility and airflow, then accepted a somewhat boxy profile because it allowed large side door openings. Those doors would make loading casualties and troops far easier in the mud, dust, and confusion of field conditions. Reliability and ease of maintenance received equal attention, because this helicopter would only matter if it could fly several sorties a day from rough forward bases. At a glance, the UH-1 series became a light utility helicopter built by Bell for the United States Army and other services. It entered service in the late 1950s and came of age during the Vietnam War. A typical Huey troop carrier variant carried a crew of pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, and often a door gunner, plus roughly a squad of infantry in the cabin. In that transport role, its primary armament was usually a pair of door-mounted machine guns that gave some measure of suppressive fire during approaches and departures. Dedicated gunship versions of the same basic airframe traded cabin space for fixed forward-firing guns, rocket pods, and sometimes grenade launchers. In level flight, the Huey could cruise at well over 100 miles per hour and had the range to lift troops from distant bases into remote landing zones without stopping to refuel. As confidence in the design grew, production orders expanded, and the single basic airframe turned into a family of variants. Early medical evacuation versions were fitted to carry litters and medical attendants, pulling wounded soldiers out of the field with a speed that older systems could never match. Training models helped build the pool of pilots and crew chiefs needed to sustain large-scale air assault operations. Other subtypes focused on troop transport, gunship duties, or specialized roles, all sharing common parts and maintenance habits. By the time American involvement in Vietnam deepened, the Huey was no longer an experiment on the edge of doctrine. It had become a mature, mass-produced utility helicopter that could be assembled, shipped overseas, and operated in large numbers, ready to anchor the new airmobile approach to warfare. To understand why the Huey left such a mark on its crews, it helps to walk through the aircraft from nose to tail. Up front, the cockpit places the pilot and co-pilot side by side beneath a wide greenhouse of glass panels. Visibility is excellent by design, with large forward and side windows that allow a clear view of terrain, treetops, and other aircraft in the formation. The instrument panel appears simple by modern standards, carrying the essential flight gauges, engine instruments, and radios laid out so that either pilot can monitor the helicopter's health while the other focuses on flying. Between and above their seats, overhead controls and switches connect directly to the engine and rotor systems, a constant reminder that this machine rewards careful hands and punishes rough ones. Behind the cockpit bulkhead lies the main cabin, which is the heart of the Huey's utility. Metal bench seats line the sides of the compartment, and in a pure troop carrier configuration, they can be folded up or removed to create space for stretchers, cargo, or extra ammunition. Wide sliding doors on both sides can be opened and left that way in flight, turning the cabin into a breezy, deafening space where door gunners crouch behind their weapons and infantrymen look straight down at the jungle passing beneath them. The floor is reinforced to tolerate constant abuse from boots, mud, and fuel spills because the aircraft is expected to live on rough forward strips, cleared paddies, and improvised landing spots. It is not built for pristine, paved airfields alone. Above the cabin roof sits the turboshaft engine, enclosed in cowling but impossible to ignore in the vibration and noise that permeate the airframe. Power from that engine flows through a transmission and into the two-bladed main rotor, whose wide disc defines the helicopter's working envelope in hover and forward flight. The tail boom extends behind the cabin and carries the drive shaft out to the tail rotor. That smaller rotor counters the torque of the main blades and responds to the pilot's pedal inputs to yaw the helicopter left or right. Mechanically, the layout is straightforward, but every component represents a compromise between weight, strength, and the ability to survive combat damage or hard landings. The crew that lives inside this structure develops its own rhythm and habits. The aircraft commander, usually sitting in the right seat, makes the final decisions about approach direction, landing or waving off, and how to handle emergencies. The co-pilot manages radios and navigation and spends much of the flight scanning for threats, obstacles, and other aircraft, especially when the workload spikes near a landing zone. In the back, the crew chief treats the Huey as a personal responsibility, handling daily inspections, minor repairs, and the constant cleaning and adjusting to keep the helicopter ready. The door gunner, sometimes the same person as the crew chief in smaller crews, concentrates on providing suppressive fire, calling out incoming threats, and helping troops get on and off the aircraft when seconds matter. Subsystems that might seem routine from the outside play a deep role in how this team works. Intercom headsets knit the crew into a single nervous system, allowing quiet corrections, quick warnings, and shared observations to pass between cockpit and cabin, despite the roar of the rotor. Radios tie the helicopter into higher headquarters, ground units, and other aircraft, so that it functions as a moving node in a larger network rather than an isolated machine. Fuel tanks, often placed under or beside the cabin floor, give the Huey the range it needs to reach distant landing zones and return, but they also create vulnerabilities. Crews learn to respect those tanks when planning approach paths, holding patterns and escape routes in case enemy fire starts to walk toward the aircraft. For the soldiers riding in back, the Huey can feel like both a cramped metal box and a lifeline at the same time. The smell of fuel, hydraulic fluid, and sweat, the slap of rotor wash, and the shouted last-minute instructions before landing all sink into memory. In training, instructors talk about center of gravity, rotor disc loading, and approach profiles as technical subjects. In the field, those ideas become very real when a heavily loaded helicopter claws for altitude over a hot landing zone or drops sharply into a tight clearing surrounded by trees. The Huey is a product of engineering choices about engines, rotors, and structure. For the people inside it, those choices are experienced as noise, vibration, trust in the crew, and the ever-present edge of fear. The first real test of the Huey as a combat system came in Vietnam against a backdrop of red earth, elephant grass, and distant tree lines. In the mid-1960s, as American ground forces increased, air cavalry and air mobile units began to use the helicopter not just as a flying taxi, but as the center of their fighting style. Operations in the Central Highlands and in valleys like Ia Drang showed what that meant in practice. Companies of infantry no longer marched for long hours to reach a fight. Instead, they lifted off in serials of helicopters, staggered in altitude and spacing, then descended toward landing zones that might be no more than small clearings cut from dense jungle. A well-known pattern emerged. Gunship versions of the Huey and heavier attack helicopters orbited the landing zone, raking suspected enemy positions with rockets and machine gun fire as the troop carriers approached. Transport Hueys then darted in, flared, and hovered just long enough for soldiers to jump from the skids into tall grass or dust. Moments later, the aircraft climbed away to bring in another wave of troops or to evacuate the first wounded. Days of marching and staging collapsed into minutes of controlled chaos on a patch of ground that could be as dangerous as any trench line or beachhead in earlier wars. For the men on those landing zones, the moment of arrival was often the most lethal. The helicopters had to slow, descend, and commit to a narrow corridor of approach and departure. Enemy forces that held their fire until that instant could bring concentrated small arms and heavy machine gun fire onto thin-skinned aircraft with limited options to maneuver. The landing zone itself became a deadly funnel, where the Huey's speed and agility were briefly trapped by the need to deliver or extract people under direct fire. Every successful lift carried with it the knowledge that one misjudged approach or one well-timed ambush could turn the landing zone into a graveyard of twisted rotor blades and burned cabins. These early air assaults were a brutal test of theory. The same helicopter that could deliver troops rapidly could also be pinned down or destroyed if the enemy was close enough, disciplined enough, and well-positioned. At Ia Drang, landing zones such as X-Ray and Albany showed both the power and the vulnerability of the new tactics. When properly supported, Hueys could reinforce isolated companies, shift forces quickly along a fluid front, and pull casualties out of terrain that would otherwise have condemned them. When taken by surprise or pressed too close to larger enemy formations, those same aircraft became exposed targets in a narrow skyway that offered little room to escape. Over time, units refined how they used their helicopters. They adjusted approach directions to exploit ridges, tree lines, and folds in the ground that could hide them until the last possible moment. Coordination with artillery and fixed-wing aircraft grew tighter, with suppressive fire planned to cover the critical seconds when the helicopters were low and slow over the landing zone. Door gunners experimented with different patterns of fire, learning when short bursts and when wide sweeps best discouraged enemy shooters. Pilots learned to read wind, smoke, and the pattern of incoming fire in a heartbeat, deciding whether to wave off or commit. Infantry learned to move quickly off the landing zone, secure perimeters, and mark fresh clearings for follow-on lifts. Through both success and bitter loss, the Huey proved that air assault could work, but only when leaders respected its limits and planned carefully for the moments of greatest exposure. From the perspective of its crews and passengers, the Huey's greatest strength was its sheer versatility. In one mission, it might deliver infantry into a contested clearing. In another, it might haul ammunition and water to a remote firebase, and in a third, it might evacuate wounded men from the edge of a firefight. The same basic airframe could be reconfigured between sorties, shifting seats, stretchers, and weapons to meet whatever the day demanded. Pilots praised its responsive controls and the way the turbine engine gave them a margin of power, especially when compared to earlier piston-powered helicopters. The large side doors and open cabin made loading and unloading fast, which mattered immensely when every second on a hot landing zone could mean the difference between getting out or being shot down. Ground commanders valued the way Hueys turned ridgelines, rivers, and jungle from nearly absolute barriers into difficult but workable obstacles. Those strengths came with hard limits. The Huey was not a flying tank. While some critical areas and crew positions received armor, the aircraft remained vulnerable to concentrated small arms and heavy machine gun fire. Fuel tanks, control linkages, and rotor blades could all be damaged by hits that an armored personnel carrier might shrug off. In hot, high conditions or when heavily loaded, the helicopter's performance margins narrowed sharply, forcing pilots to nurse their power and accept that a fully burdened aircraft might struggle to clear trees or climb away from the landing zone. Maintenance demands were relentless as well. Dust, heat, and the strain of repeated hard landings punished engines, transmissions, and rotor systems, keeping mechanics and crew chiefs busy day and night just to keep enough aircraft flying. Enemies learned quickly to exploit these vulnerabilities. They studied approach and departure patterns, timed their fire for the moments when helicopters were slow, low, and fully committed, and used terrain to mask their positions until the last possible instant. At the same time, those on the receiving end of Huey-borne assaults came to fear how quickly a quiet valley or ridgeline could fill with enemy troops delivered from the sky. For crews, the balance between strengths and weaknesses was deeply personal. They knew the aircraft gave them reach and flexibility that no earlier generation had enjoyed, yet they also lived with the knowledge that a single burst of fire in the wrong place could bring the machine down in seconds, with little margin for rescue. As the basic UH-1 airframe proved itself, it evolved into a family of closely related machines tailored to different roles. Early medical evacuation variants were configured to carry litters and medical attendants, turning the helicopter into a flying ambulance that could pull wounded soldiers out of contact and deliver them to surgical facilities far faster than ground transport allowed. Troop carrier versions emphasized bench seating and door gun mounts, sacrificing some comfort for maximum capacity and speed of loading. Dedicated gunships traded cabin space for fixed forward-firing guns, rocket pods, and sometimes grenade launchers, transforming the Huey into an attack platform that could escort its transport cousins. Together, formations of troop ships and gunships gave commanders a flexible toolset, combining delivery and protection in a single coordinated package. With time, more powerful engines and refined rotor systems appeared, giving later Huey variants better performance in demanding conditions. Improved avionics and communications suites increased their ability to coordinate with ground units and other aircraft, especially in poor weather or at night. Some versions were adapted for command and control, fitted with extra radios and mapping equipment so that leaders could oversee operations from an airborne vantage point. Others served primarily as training platforms, helping to build the large cadre of pilots, crew chiefs, and door gunners needed to sustain high sortie rates. Across these subtypes, common parts and maintenance practices simplified logistics in the field, another quiet advantage in a long war. The experience of operating Hueys in Vietnam and other theaters also shaped the next generation of utility helicopters. Crews and designers alike saw the limits of a single-engine machine under heavy fire or in extreme heat and altitude. That experience influenced the development of twin-engine successors with greater lift, built-in redundancy, and improved protection for crews and critical systems. Even so, many air forces and armies around the world continued to operate Huey variants and license-built relatives for decades. In many of those fleets, the helicopters received modern avionics, radios, and weapons, while retaining the same familiar silhouette and basic layout that first flew into Vietnamese landing zones. Long after major American combat units left Vietnam, the sound of the Huey's rotor remained one of the most recognizable signatures of that war. Its influence on doctrine and design went far beyond a single conflict. The idea of air assault, of inserting and sustaining infantry by helicopter at scale, became a core part of how many armies thought about mobility, surprise, and reinforcement. Later utility helicopters inherited not only mechanical lessons about engines, rotors, and transmissions, but also human lessons about crew coordination, landing zone tactics, and the psychological effect of helicopters on both friend and foe. Training programs, manuals, and simulations carried forward scenarios built around the kinds of missions Hueys had flown thousands of times. Today, surviving Hueys can be found in museums, on memorial fields, and in some cases still in active service with smaller forces or civilian operators. Visitors to aviation museums in the United States and abroad can walk up to a retired UH-1, peer into the cockpit, and see the bench seats and door frames where crews once rode into combat. Some helicopters are preserved in markings that recall specific units and campaigns, giving a sense of the formations they once served. Others stand as static displays at veterans, memorials, or outside armories, their rotor blades fixed in place above lawns and parking lots. On rare occasions, flight-worthy examples still appear at airshows. Lifting off with veterans and new generations aboard, the familiar rotor beat carrying echoes of past missions. For those who cannot reach a museum, photographic and video collections offer close views of the Huey in action and at rest, including interior tours and cockpit walkthroughs. Features under the dispatch banner and related trackpads content help tie those images to the stories of the soldiers and aircrews who depended on the helicopter. The Huey's legacy is not only about changing doctrine or inspiring later designs, it also rests in the countless individual journeys it made, carrying the wounded to safety, the weary back to base, and the determined into battle. You can also hear narrated versions of Arsenal features as part of the Trackpad's podcast feeds and Dispatch audio editions, which keeps the sound and story of this helicopter alive for new listeners.